The intake briefing ran 40 minutes. I know because Dresch counted it out loud in a whisper from the seat next to me, ticking off 5-minute intervals on his fingers until I told him, also in a whisper, to stop. He stopped. He started tapping his knee instead. That is Dresch. He cannot be entirely still in any room that is making him impatient, and the intake briefing was making all four of us impatient, though the other cadets in the theater didn't seem to share that feeling. The other cadets looked, if anything, like they were attending a funeral. There were 62 of us in the briefing theater. 4 were human. The rest were Garavan or Garavan-adjacent species from the Sural cluster that shared enough biology with Garavans to train in the same cold-weather survival curriculum. Long-limbed, broad-chested, with a dense subcutaneous layer that gave them their characteristic gray-blue undertone in cool air, and a metabolic architecture calibrated for sustained cold-weather operation. They were, by most measures, among the most physically capable species in the Institute's intake roster. The Vel Orath Survival Institute admitted them in large numbers specifically because they were well suited to what the Institute was known for. What the Institute was known for was the proving plateau. The briefing officer was a Garavan named Instructor Velsoth, which is a title as much as a name. Velsoth means approximately one who has passed through in the old Garavan dialect, and every officer who administers the proving trial carries it. She was perhaps 60 in Garavan years, which maps to something in the early 40s by human reckoning, and she carried herself the way senior Garavan instructors always did. Upright, still, with the faint, deliberate quality of someone who has decided that economy of motion is itself a form of competence. She did not pace. She did not gesture broadly. She stood at the front of the theater and she spoke. I will summarize what she said, because 40 minutes of briefing cannot be reproduced here, and most of it was procedural anyway. The substance was this. The Proving Plateau was a 72-hour wilderness survival trial conducted on the glacial flats of Vel Orath's northern continent. Cadets would be transported by shuttle to the trial insertion point at 0600 the following morning. Each cadet would carry a standard-issue survival pack containing 1 emergency beacon, 1 emergency thermal wrap of Garavan manufacture, 1 ration block, and 1 signal flare. Nothing else. The objective was to reach Threshold Gate 7, a fixed point 11 kilometers northwest of the insertion zone, before the 72-hour trial window closed. The Keth Proving Engine, the trial's automated assessment architecture, would track each cadet's position, biometric status, and decision-making indicators in real time via the implanted monitoring nodes that all cadets received at enrollment. It would log each cadet's progress and assign a pass or fail determination at the 72-hour mark. Historically, Instructor Velsoth said, approximately 60% of first-year cadets did not reach Threshold Gate 7 within the trial window. 60%. She let that number sit in the air for a moment. It landed differently on different people. The Garavan cadets around us, the ones who'd grown up on the cluster worlds, who'd trained in cold weather conditions since adolescence, who were in many respects ideally built for exactly this kind of test, they straightened slightly when she said it. Not confidence. Something older than confidence. Something that looks like preparation. Beside me, Dresch stopped tapping his knee. I noticed because the absence of tapping was louder than the tapping had been. I glanced over. He was doing the thing he does when he's doing math in his head, the slight unfocus of the eyes, the barely perceptible movement of his lips, working something out. On my other side, Priya had her arms folded and was looking at the projected map of the Proving Plateau on the briefing screen with the expression she gets when she's looking at a trail map. Not concern. Assessment. Priya had grown up in the Himachali hill country and had spent most of her adolescence either hiking up things or hiking down things, and she assessed terrain the way other people read text. Functionally, automatically, extracting relevant data as a matter of course. Behind us, Oak hadn't moved since the briefing started. Oak rarely moved when he was taking in information. He just absorbed it. Later you'd find out he'd retained all of it. Instructor Velsoth continued. The proving plateau maintained an ambient temperature of approximately -22 degrees Celsius at night, rising to -8 during the 8 hours of Vel Oreth's reduced luminosity day cycle. Wind off the northern glaciers averaged 31 kilometers per hour with gusts to 60. Precipitation was possible. The terrain between the insertion point and threshold gate 7 included 2 frozen river crossings, a ridge ascent of roughly 400 meters elevation, and a descent across loose glacial scree that was, she said, the section most likely to result in emergency beacon activation. Emergency beacon activation was not a pass. It was a medical extraction and a fail. She went through the survival pack contents one more time slowly. The thermal wrap, Garavan manufacture, rated to -30, designed to provide a minimum viable sleep environment for a Garavan adult of average mass. The ration block, calibrated to Garavan metabolic baseline, approximately 2,200 calories, sufficient for the trial if rationed across all 3 days. The beacon, the flare. She paused. She said that historically, cadets who activated their emergency beacons did so between hours 36 and 48 of the trial. The first 12 hours, she said, cadets were still running on adrenaline and had not yet depleted their caloric reserves. After 48 hours, the ones still moving had generally made their decision to commit. The middle window, the long, cold middle, was where most cadets broke. She said this without editorializing. She was not trying to frighten anyone. She was, as far as I could tell, simply informing us of what the data showed. Then she said the 4 of us, the 4 human cadets, would be assessed under the same parameters as all other cadets. There had been some internal discussion at the faculty level about whether human-specific adjustments to the pack contents were warranted, given documented physiological differences. The faculty had decided against adjustments on the grounds that the Institute's founding charter prohibited differential material provision within a single intake cohort. We would receive the same packs as everyone else. She said this also without editorializing, but she looked at us when she said it, just briefly. Something in her eyes that wasn't quite sympathy and wasn't quite apology but lived somewhere near both of them. I looked back at her and I didn't say anything because there was nothing to say. Not yet, anyway. After the briefing, the 4 of us walked back to the dormitory wing together, which we almost always did. We'd been assigned to the same squad at enrollment, which the Institute had done deliberately. The 4 humans in an intake of 62, grouped together, which was either thoughtful accommodation or an administrative convenience, and I'd never decided which. Either way, we'd become a unit the way people do when they're outnumbered and their names don't fit the way the room says names. We got to the common corridor outside our bunk rooms and Dresch said, -22. Yeah, I said. That's Denver in February. Colder than Denver in February, Priya said. Denver bottoms out around -15 or so on a bad night. This is -22 sustained. Okay, Patagonia in August then. Southern Patagonia, maybe. Either way, Dresch said, I've been colder than that. He had been colder than that. We had all been colder than that. Not in the same place or the same context, but the range of temperatures the briefing officer had described was, if I'm being precise, a range that any of us had encountered in an ordinary year on Earth, in an ordinary life, without emergency beacons or institutional support structures. -22 Celsius is cold. It is serious cold. It will kill you if you handle it wrong, and handling it wrong on Earth was absolutely something people did every year and died for it. I am not dismissing the danger. I am saying that for people who grew up in the Northern Hemisphere, or at elevation, or in places where winter was a real thing you prepared for and moved through, the temperature range the Institute had built a 60% failure rate trial around was recognizable. Oak said, the thermal wrap is going to be the wrong size. He said it the way he said most things, factually, without decoration. Wrong how? I asked, though I suspected I knew. Caravan adult average mass is something like 90 kilograms. I'm 64. The wrap is going to be proportioned for someone 30% larger. It'll be loose. More dead air space, Priya said. That's actually okay if we conceal it. We conceal it, Oak said. How much cordage do we get? Dresh asked. None listed in the pack contents, I said. Dresh made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Okay, we improvise cordage. We improvise cordage, I agreed. From what? We'll find something, I looked at him. We always find something. He nodded. That was the end of the conversation. We went to bed. I want to describe the night before the trial, because I think it matters. The dormitory wing had a communal area, long tables, low lighting, the slightly too warm ambient temperature the Institute maintained for caravan comfort. And when I walked through it at around 2200 hours to get water, most of the caravan cadets were still awake. Quietly awake, in a way that was distinct from the usual evening murmur of a shared barracks. They were checking packs, reviewing topographic maps on personal data slates, going through the pack contents with a methodical repetition that suggested they were less reviewing and more reassuring themselves. Some of them were in small groups, speaking in the low-register caravan dialect that I'd learned a bit of but not enough to follow quickly. I caught the word for crossing several times. I caught the word for temperature. I got my water and went back to my bunk. I slept. This is not bravery. I want to be clear about that. I slept because I was tired, and because I had assessed the situation and determined that lying awake reviewing a survival plan I was already confident in would not improve the plan. The caravan cadets who stayed up late reviewing topographic maps were not being foolish. They were being thorough in the face of genuine uncertainty. The uncertainty they felt was real, and the trial was genuinely difficult for them. The uncertainty I felt was of a different kind. Less about whether we would survive the conditions, and more about what exactly we were going to do with 50+ hours of spare time after we reached the gate. We boarded the shuttle at 05:45. The insertion zone was a flat expanse of packed snow and rock about 100 meters across, ringed with marker beacons that served as both a geographic reference and the starting edge of the Keth-proving engine's monitoring field. We were dropped in 12 at a time, 3 shuttle loads. We were in the second load. The shuttle touched down, the ramp lowered, and the cold came in immediately, not aggressive, not a slap, just present and clear and honest. -19 at 0600, the shuttle crew had announced. A reasonable morning. I stepped off the ramp and the snow under my boots had a particular quality, packed, with a thin breakable crust on top from overnight radiation cooling, and I registered this automatically, the way you register anything that might be relevant. The footing was sound if you stepped deliberately. The crust would break under hurried movement and slow you down if you let it. Noted. The rest of the second shuttle load assembled on the flat. 6 caravan cadets and the 4 of us. A caravan named Tarith 1, who'd been in the same orientation group as Dresh, and had developed an awkward acquaintance with him over shared confusion about the Institute's filing systems, caught Dresh's eye and said something brief in caravan. Dresh's caravan was better than mine. He replied, and Tarith 1 made the caravan gesture that I'd come to read as something between acknowledgement and farewell, a slight dip of the left shoulder, and then moved off northwest with his group. What'd he say? Priya asked. Something like hope your beacons work, Dresh said. Not mean about it, just he meant it sincerely. That's sweet, Oak said, checking the buckle on his pack strap. It is actually sweet, Dresh agreed. The third shuttle load descended. Now all 62 of us were on the plateau. Instructor Velsoth's voice came through the monitoring node with a brief activation tone and 3 words. Trial is live. Then the monitoring node went quiet because the proving engine didn't communicate with you during the trial. It only listened. The caravan cadets moved out quickly. They'd clearly drilled on the opening phase, get distance from the insertion zone, establish a bearing, begin the traverse before the morning temperature dropped further at midday shade. They knew the terrain better than we did, or had studied it harder, and their first-hour movement reflected that. Within 20 minutes of activation, most of them had cleared the flat and were into the first stretch of broken terrain. We watched them go, then we looked at each other. "Fire first," I said. "Fire first," Priya agreed. "We're not actually cold yet," Dresh pointed out. "No," I said, "that's why we build it now." This is the thing about cold weather survival that the formal curriculum teaches as principle, but that you only really learn by doing. The time to build your fire is before you need your fire, not when you're shaking, not when your fingers have lost the dexterity for fine motor work. You build it when you're functional and warm and have margin, and then you have a fire. The proving engine, we assumed, expected cadets to begin traversing immediately and to deal with shelter and warmth as emergency responses to the conditions. That is how the trial was structured. The insertion zone had no natural shelter, no prepared resources, and the kit was minimally provisioned specifically to make the first night a test of resource management under stress. We were planning to make the first night not happen by not being here for it. But before we left, we needed to solve the cordage problem, and the fire was part of that. The insertion zone's marker beacons were mounted on lightweight composite stakes driven into the snow. The stakes were not part of our equipment. They were institute infrastructure, but the plastic retaining clips that attached the beacon units to the stakes were small, flat, and clearly designed for tool-free removal, maintenance access. I looked at one for a moment. Oak looked at me looking at it. "How many?" he asked. 6 clips per beacon, 8 beacons in the ring, I said. 48 clips. "Not cordage," he said. "No, but if we lash them into a continuous strip with the fibers from the thermal wrap's edge binding." I indicated the wrap, still in my pack, which had a woven edge binder made of synthetic fiber. "That's about 4 meters of binder per wrap, 4 wraps between us. 16 meters of synthetic fiber and 48 plastic clips," Oak said. He thought about it. "For sealing the wraps, yes, that works." We spent 11 minutes at the insertion zone. We stripped the edge binding from 2 of the 4 thermal wraps. I kept mine and Dresh's intact. We used Priya's and Oak's, and collected the beacon retaining clips, which the marker units did not require to remain functional. We built a small fire from the dry scrub vegetation that grew in the lee of the insertion zone's rock border, using Dresh's lighter, which was not institute-issued, and which the pack contents briefing had never addressed because the institute had presumably not imagined that cadets would bring lighters. Dresh had brought a lighter because Dresh grew up in a part of New Mexico where his grandfather had taken him camping every summer since he was 6, and his grandfather had told him that a man who doesn't carry a lighter is a man who's already asking for help. Dresh had internalized this. He always had a lighter. We used the fire to melt snow in Priya's ration block wrapper, which was a sealed foil pouch designed for a single use but which could be repurposed as a vessel if you were careful. We each drank half a liter of water and refilled the pouch for transit. Then we put the fire out carefully, full snow coverage, no residual smoke, took our bearings and began moving. The first river crossing was 3.2 kilometers from the insertion zone. We reached it in 41 minutes. The ice was solid. The temperature range of the trial precluded anything that wasn't, and the question was not whether we could cross, but where the ice was thickest, and what the bank access looked like. Priya scouted upstream 200 meters and found a section where the bank dropped more gradually, and the ice showed the deeper color that indicates greater thickness. We crossed in under 10 minutes, single file with spacing. No one broke through. Oak tested with a boot heel strike every few meters and kept reporting that it was fine, which it was. We stopped on the far bank for water. Used the fire kit again, another fire, quicker this time, snow melted in the foil pouch, water consumed, fire out. 7 minutes total. Dresh was watching our time against the elevation profile ahead. "We've got the ridge ascent next," he said. "If the going's like this," he indicated the snow surface with a sweep of his hand, 4, maybe 5 hours to the top. "The scree descent after will be slower," Priya said. "How much slower?" She thought about it. "Depends on consolidation. If it's frozen hard, it's just careful movement. If there's any loose material on top," she made a leveling gesture, "could be 2 hours for what should be a 40-minute descent." "Either way," I said, "we're through the ridge before dark." Oak was looking at the sky. "We have about 6 hours of usable light. That's the ridge, the descent, and part of the approach to the gate." "We don't need to reach the gate in the light," I said. "We need to reach it before hour 72. We're going to reach it before hour." I checked the time on my monitoring node's passive readout, which was the one function it performed for you in real time. "Hour 12, I'd estimate. Maybe 14 if the scree is bad." Nobody said anything for a moment. Dresh said, "The proving engine is going to have a problem with that." "The proving engine is going to have many problems," I said, "but that's the proving engine's problem." He grinned. We moved out. I should say something about the ridge, because it deserves its description, and because the Garavan cadets we passed during the ascent deserve something too. The ridge rose roughly 400 meters over approximately 2 kilometers of horizontal distance, a consistent gradient broken by 2 shelf sections, where the terrain leveled briefly before resuming the climb. The snow on the lower third was granular, old, compacted by repeated freeze-thaw cycles into a surface that held well underfoot. The middle third transitioned to a harder wind pack, the kind where you can feel the resistance under your boot sole before you commit your weight, where the surface gives nothing and demands precision in return. The upper third was the most exposed, less snow, more rock showing through where the wind had scoured the ridge clean, the kind of mixed terrain that looks deceptively fast until you're on it, and discover that every third or fourth step requires a judgment about which surface is actually bearing your weight. We took it section by section, adjusting pace to the terrain rather than pushing a fixed cadence. That is the thing about high-altitude cold weather movement that most people learn too late. It is not a sprint and it is not a slog. It is a negotiation. The terrain tells you something with each step and you listen to it, and when you stop listening is when it collects its tax. There was a period around the second shelf, maybe an hour into the climb, where the wind shifted and came directly off the glacier to the north, and the temperature dropped noticeably. Not dramatically, not dangerously, but the kind of drop that makes you pull your collar up and reset your breathing cadence. We pulled our collars up and reset our breathing cadence. Dresh, who was directly behind me at that point, said nothing. He just went quieter, which with Dresh is a signal. He was routing more attention to the work and less to conversation. That was the right call. I did the same. We passed 6 Garavan cadets on the ascent, or rather, we passed what had been a group of 6 that had become something more fragmented. 2 of them had stopped on the first shelf in the shelter of a rock outcrop and were consulting a map. They'd spread it between them and were tracing routes with a gloved finger, and the careful deliberateness of the gesture told me they were not simply reviewing terrain they already understood but genuinely reassessing, which meant something about the first section of the trial had not gone according to plan. I didn't know what, and it wasn't my business to ask. One was moving slowly and seemed to be favoring her left leg. Not injured, I thought, but managing a boot fit issue, the kind of deep ache that develops when a boot is laced at the wrong tension for a long descent, and then a long ascent in that order. I'd had that specific problem once, on a trail in the Cascades when I was 19, and I'd spent 4 miles thinking very carefully about each step in a way that is its own education. She was getting that education now. There was nothing wrong with her that rest, and a dry sock wouldn't address. 3 more were still climbing steadily but had spread out, each finding their own pace, no longer operating as a unit. This happens. You leave together with a plan to stay together, and then the terrain has opinions about the plan. The gaps open. The question is whether the gaps mean something about commitment and will, which they often don't, or whether they mean something about the mismatch between an individual's pace and the pace the group set, which is almost always what's actually happening. These three were fine. They were moving well individually, and if they regrouped at the top, they'd be all right. We passed all of them, not because we were rushing. We were not rushing. We were moving at the pace that felt right for sustained aerobic output in cold air at moderate altitude, controlled, rhythmic, not burning reserves, not stopping unless there was a reason to stop. It happened to be faster than the pace the Garavan cadets were sustaining, but I don't think speed was the relevant variable. The relevant variable was efficiency, and beneath efficiency was something harder to name. The absence of the particular expenditure that happens when a person is not sure whether they can do the thing they're trying to do. That uncertainty costs you, even when you overcome it. It is physiologically real. The Garavan cadets were moving through conditions their physiology was suited for, but that their nervous systems were treating as an emergency. And an emergency mode nervous system is an expensive one to operate. We weren't under psychological load. The cadet with the boot issue looked up as we passed her. Her name was Vorsatha, I knew from orientation. We'd shared a table at the welcome assembly, and she'd asked Priya a careful, genuine question about human dietary restrictions, whether humans could tolerate the complex carbohydrate compounds in Garavan grain substitute products, which was a reasonable thing to wonder. And Priya had answered with equal care, and rather more specificity than Vorsatha had been expecting. They'd had a conversation about food that went on for perhaps 20 minutes and ended with both of them looking mildly surprised at having had it. Vorsatha looked at us now, and then looked at the terrain above us, and then looked back at us. In Garavan, she said, and I understood this one clearly, you're going to the top today. We're going to the gate today, I said. She was quiet for a moment. The wind moved across the shelf between us. She looked at me with the particular directness that Garavans use when they're deciding whether a piece of information is something they have a frame for, and deciding, apparently, that they do not. Then she said something I didn't entirely catch, but Dresh translated it for me later as roughly. I believe you, and I don't understand it at all. The top of the ridge was flat and exposed, maybe 40 meters across, with the full wind unobstructed from the north. We crossed it without stopping. You don't stop on top, you get off the top. The scree descent on the south side was the part of the trial the briefing had identified as the most likely beacon activation zone, and I could see why. The upper third of the descent was loose glacial till angular fragments ranging from fist-sized to head-sized, deposited in a layer over the underlying bedrock by what had clearly been a significant glacial recession event. Some of it was frozen in place, some of it was not. The challenge was that you couldn't always tell which was which from above, and committing your weight to a fragment that then shifted could send you down a slope that had no good flat terminus until the valley floor, which was far enough down to be a serious problem. Priya led the descent. This was not a democracy. Priya had grown up moving over terrain like this, and she knew the language of it in a way the rest of us didn't, and we all understood that, so she led and we followed her line. She moved in a controlled diagonal traverse, cutting left, then right, testing before committing, finding the line where the consolidation was better. It took an hour and 40 minutes. It was not dangerous if you followed the line. It was the kind of careful, sustained attention that asks a lot of you over time. The mental cost of not letting the concentration lapse, not trusting the next step before you've earned the trust. When we reached the valley floor, Oak sat down on a flat rock and ate part of his ration block. He didn't say anything. He ate methodically and looked at the terrain we'd come down and then looked at the terrain ahead. Then he stood up and we moved. The valley between the ridge and threshold gate 7 was, by the map we'd memorized, approximately 3.8 kilometers of comparatively flat terrain, frozen grass-equivalent vegetation, low rock outcrops, a second river crossing roughly 2 kilometers in. The light was beginning to flatten toward late afternoon by the time we entered the valley. The temperature was dropping back toward the nighttime range. We had perhaps 3 hours of usable visibility before the Vel-Oreth day cycle closed down to its nighttime minimum. "We're not going to make the gate in the light," Priya said, not distressed, just nodding. "No," I agreed. "We'll make the second crossing in the light and the final approach in the dark." "I can navigate that," Oak said. He could. Oak's spatial memory for terrain he'd traversed was nearly perfect. He'd grown up in the Rwandan highlands, where his father had taught him to navigate by starlight before he was 12. Vel-Oreth had stars. Vel-Oreth had a reasonable star density at this latitude. He'd been mapping them since we landed. "What are we doing for the night?" Dresh asked. "We're going to reach the gate first," I said. "If that takes us into the night, we build a camp on the far side and wait for morning, if we're there with time to spare before the window opens." "There's no window," Priya said. "The gate is just a sensor post. It reads our monitoring nodes when we pass through. The engine logs the time." "Right, so we pass through and then we camp." "And then we tell them," Oak said quietly. "Yes," I said, "and then we tell them." The second river crossing was shallower than the first and faster. The valley gradient pushed the water through at a higher velocity even under the ice, and the banks were lower and more accessible. We crossed in under 6 minutes. We were through and moving again before the light entirely failed. The final 2 kilometers to Threshold Gate 7 were not difficult. They were cold, and they were dark after the first 40 minutes, and the wind had found us again in the open valley, but they were not difficult. Oak navigated from memory and star reference. Priya and Dresh kept pace and kept quiet. I thought about the briefing theater and instructor Velsoth's eyes when she looked at us after explaining the pack contents, and I tried to decide what I was going to say to whoever was on the other end of the monitoring channel when we arrived. Threshold Gate 7 was a tall composite arch set into the ground, a permanent structure, not a temporary marker, with a sensor bank in each leg that read monitoring node signatures as cadets passed through. There was a small equipment cache built into the base of the left leg, a heating unit, additional ration blocks, and a field medical kit, there for cadets who reached the gate in a depleted state. There was also a communication unit, a push-button channel to the Institute's trial monitoring station. We reached it at 2200 and 14 minutes into the trial. 14 hours and 14 minutes after activation. We had 57 hours and 46 minutes left in the 72-hour window. We stood in front of it for a moment. The sensor bank read our monitoring nodes as we passed through. I felt the faint buzz that indicated a successful node ping, and the gate's status light cycled from amber to green 4 times in sequence as it logged us. Then it went back to amber, waiting for the next arrival. Dresh read the time off his node display and said the number out loud. 14 hours, 14 minutes. Nobody celebrated. There was nothing to celebrate exactly. We'd walked in the cold for a day and built some fires and crossed some ice. That was the thing we'd done. Oak opened the equipment cache and pulled out the heating unit. He set it running and we moved into its range and stood there, and the warmth it put out was the particular sweetness of any warmth after sustained cold, not dramatic, not overwhelming, just correct, just right. I could feel the muscles across my shoulders release something they'd been holding since the ridge. After a few minutes, I pressed the push button on the communication unit. A voice came back almost immediately. A monitoring technician, Garavan, young-sounding, probably on a standard hours shift with nothing much expected to happen until day 2 or 3 of the trial. "Monitoring station, identify." "Cadet Sakal, Squad 17, I said. "We're at Threshold Gate 7, all 4 members of our squad, logging successful gate passage." A pause. "Cadet Sakal, what is your current trial time?" 14 hours, 14 minutes from activation." A longer pause. Please repeat that figure. 14 hours and 14 minutes, I said. We arrived at 22:14 on trial day 1. The pause this time was long enough that I was about to ask if the channel was still active. Please hold, the technician said. And then he was gone, and there was the faint carrier tone of an open line, and we stood by the heating unit in the dark at the gate and waited. Dresch had gotten into the ration cache. He was reading the ingredient list on one of the Garavan ration blocks with his monitoring node held as a light source, turning it over in his hands. These are actually not bad, he said. The protein content is. Don't start, Priya said. I'm just saying the caloric density is. Dresch. He put the ration block back. He picked up a different one. He looked at Oak. You want one? Yes, Oak said. They ate ration blocks. I stayed by the communication unit and watched the valley below the gate, dark, cold, still. The way wilderness is when nothing is wrong with it. No beacon activations yet that we could detect, though the monitoring array would know. The 62 had become 58 in my head count by the time we left the insertion zone. 4 cadets had activated their beacons in the first 90 minutes. That number would grow tonight. The channel clicked back to life. The voice that came through this time was not the technician. It was more deliberate, slower paced, the tone of someone who has been woken up or called in and is choosing their words. Cadet Sakal, this is Administrator Kethvar, Senior Duty Officer for this trial cycle. I have your gate passage logged at 14 hours, 14 minutes. The engine is showing 4 monitoring nodes. You have your complete squad. All 4, I said. No beacon activations, no medical events, all members ambulatory and functional. Another pause. Administrator Kethvar, are you still there? I am here, a beat. Cadet Sakal, the Keth-proving engine does not have a processing pathway for a pass determination at this time signature. Historically, the earliest logged gate arrival in this trial's 43-year run is 29 hours, 11 minutes. Your current time is, I could hear him checking, roughly half that. Yes, I said. You understand that we're going to need to review the trial record before we can issue a formal determination. I understand, I said. We'll camp here and wait for morning. The heating unit and the cache are sufficient. We're not in distress. You're, a brief pause, a different quality this time, not uncertainty but something more like adjustment, the sound of someone recalibrating their expectations of a conversation in real time. You're comfortable camping at the gate until the review is completed. We're comfortable, I said. He said he would contact us at 0600. I said that was fine. The channel closed. We built our camp in the lee of the gate structure, using the terrain the way you use what's there. The composite arch deflected the north wind considerably, and the heating unit we positioned at the camp center provided a reliable warm core. We split the 2 intact thermal wraps into a shared shelter configuration. Garavan adult-sized wraps have excess material when deployed for a 60-kilogram human, and when 2 are overlapped and bound with the clip-end fiber cordage Oak had rigged, they create a covered space that manages the wind and traps body heat effectively. Priya and Dresch went in first. Oak and I took the first watch. We didn't need a watch. There was nothing to watch for. No threat we'd identified in the valley, no reason someone needed to stay awake. But we kept the watch anyway because it was the habit. And the habit had gotten us to the gate in 14 hours, and there was no reason to stop doing the things that worked. Oak sat with his back against the gate's left leg, and I sat across from him, and we were quiet for a while with the heating unit between us and the stars above very clear, and closed the way stars are in cold, dry air, and the darkness around us very complete in the way darkness is when there is no ambient light for a great distance in any direction. Vel-Orath's star field was dense at this latitude, denser than I was used to, though I'd been here long enough that it no longer felt entirely alien. Different constellations, different densities in different regions of the sky, but the same fundamental fact of very many very old things very far away, burning. I'd always found that fact steadying in a way I couldn't entirely explain. It predated any institution, any curriculum, any assessment architecture. Whatever the Keth-proving engine concluded about the night's events, the star field would remain unchanged. "Do you think they'll have a category for it?" Oak asked. He meant the formal past determination, the proving engine's processing pathway problem. "Eventually," I said, "they'll create one." "Will it have our names on it?" "Probably not," I said. "The proving engine doesn't really do names, it does nodes." Oak made the small, quiet sound that was his version of a laugh. "Node 17 Alpha through 17 Delta, first recorded gate arrival under 15 hours. Something like that." He was quiet for a moment. He had the notebook out and was writing in it, the dense, compressed script he used when he was working something out. I didn't ask what he was writing. Oak's notebook was Oak's. He'd share it when he was ready and not before. After a while he stopped writing and looked up at the sky, following the same star field I'd been looking at. "I keep thinking about the second shuttle load," he said, "on the insertion, when Tarith 1 said goodbye to Dresh. The hope your beacons work conversation." Yes, he meant it genuinely. "I know," I said. "That's what I keep thinking about," Oak said. He wasn't being unkind. He was being accurate by his own model of the situation, and his model was reasonable. Given everything he knew about the trial and about us, 4 humans, under-provisioned at a disadvantage in the cold, his model was well constructed. The prediction was wrong, but the model wasn't bad. "The model didn't have the right inputs," I said. "No, it had all the inputs available to it, it just didn't have the right ones." He paused. "There's no shame in that. The proving engine has the same problem. You can't model for something you've never seen." I thought about that. "We're not that unusual," I said. "Plenty of humans would have struggled on this trial. The cold is real. The distance is real. If you sent 62 humans through and they had no cold weather preparation, your pass rate would probably be similar to the Garavan baseline, maybe worse." "But the humans who ended up here weren't a random sample," Oak said. "No," I said, "we weren't. That's what the model missed. Not humans in general, us specifically. What we'd each done before we ever set foot in this institution." I looked at the valley below the gate, dark and still. The proving engine assesses what cadets do in the trial. It has no mechanism for assessing what cadets did before the trial. "And yet that's the whole thing," Oak said. "That's why we're sitting here and they're out there." He indicated the valley with a small movement of his head, "Not because of biology, because of the 20 years that happened before today." He went back to his notebook. I sat with that for a while. "Tarith 1 is still out there," he said, "and the others." "Yes. Cold tonight. -20 or so," I said. "They have the wraps. The wraps are rated to -30. "I know," Oak said. He wasn't worried. He was just nodding the fact of other people in the cold, the way you do when you're warm and aware of it. "They'll make it," I said, "most of them. 60% pass rate means they don't all make it." "No," I said, "they don't all make it." We were quiet for a while longer. At 0100, I woke Priya and Dresh and took their place in the shelter, and the thermal wrap was warm from their body heat, and the cordage Oak had rigged held everything exactly where it needed to be, and I closed my eyes and was asleep quickly and without difficulty. In the morning at 0600, Administrator Kethvar came back on the channel. His voice was composed, which told me he'd had time to prepare for this call. With him was someone he introduced as Instructor Velsath, who I suspected had not entirely slept, and whose voice was the same careful, deliberate voice from the briefing theater. Kethvar confirmed the past determination. All 4 members of Squad 17, formally passed on the proving trial, logged at 14 hours and 14 minutes. He said the Keth-proving engine had flagged the event as an anomalous data point requiring category review. He said the review process was a standard protocol for any outcome that fell outside the engine's established processing pathways, and that it did not affect our pass status. He said our shuttle pickup was scheduled for the 72-hour mark, along with all other cadets, remaining passes and evacuation of beacon-activated cadets, and that we were welcome to remain at the gate until then. I said thank you. He said we were welcome. Then there was a pause and Instructor Velsoth said, "Cadet Sakal." "Instructor," I said. "When you were in the briefing theater, during the pack contents explanation, I looked at your squad." "I remember," I said. "At the time I was trying to communicate that I understood the provisions were suboptimal for your physiological parameters, and that the faculty regretted being unable to address that within the charter." "I understood," I said. "We appreciated it." A pause. I think I was communicating something more specific. What I was trying to communicate was that I was concerned the provisions would not be sufficient. Another pause, shorter, and I want to understand what happened instead. I thought about how to answer that. "The provisions were fine," I said. "The thermal wraps were a little large, but we managed the sizing. The caloric content was, honestly, a little generous for one-day travel. The conditions were serious, but they were within a range we knew." "The range your species knows," she said. "The range we individually knew," I said carefully. "Not every human would be comfortable in those conditions. We were, because of where we grew up and how." "That distinction matters," she said. "Yes," I said, "it does." Another pause, longer. I could hear something in the background at her end, the monitoring station systems, ambient voices. The trial was in hour 20 and 62 cadets had become. I didn't know the number, but the monitoring station knew and the proving engine knew, and it was somewhere less than 62. "When you get back," Instructor Velsoth said, "I'd like to speak with your squad, all four. Not about the trial record, the engine will process that through the review. I'd like to speak about a brief pause, the kind that says a person is selecting a word with some care. Preparation. What your preparation looked like before you came here. What informed it." "That's a long conversation," I said. "I have time," she said. "We have the rest of the term." I said we'd come by her office when we were back. She said good. The channel closed. We had 57 hours left in the trial window. We spent most of them at the gate. Dresch organized the equipment cache by caloric content, and then reorganized it by prep method, because the first organization bothered him. Priya went back partway toward the ridge in the morning to see if she could spot any cadets on the descent, and came back reporting 3 groups she'd identified, all moving, none in distress, though one group was moving slowly. Oak wrote in the small notebook he always carried, filling pages in the dense compressed handwriting he used when he was working something out. I slept twice more, short efficient sleeps, and spent a lot of time looking at the valley. The first beacon activation signal we were able to observe directly came at hour 28, a distant flare, southeast of our position, near the ridge descend. Then silence. Then the faint sound of a shuttle far off going in. More would follow. The engine knew their coordinates. The shuttles would find them. At hour 41, 3 cadets arrived at the gate. Garavan, 2 males and a female, moving carefully but steadily, faces showing the particular stripped quality of people who have been cold for a long time. They stopped when they saw us, genuinely stopped, in a way that meant they were recalibrating what they were looking at. One of them said something in Garavan. Dresch answered in Garavan. The cadet's expression, stripped of everything non-essential by 40 hours of cold, showed something that wasn't quite disbelief, and wasn't quite respect, and wasn't quite humor, but contained elements of all 3. He said something else. "What'd he say?" I asked. "He asked if we were cold," Dresch said. "What did you say?" "I said a little last night, not tonight." The 3 cadets accessed the gate's medical kit and the ration cache. We gave them the heating unit entirely. We had the body heat of 4 people in a sealed shelter and didn't need it the same way they did. They didn't say much. They ate and warmed and rested. Eventually Priya struck up a halting conversation with the female cadet about the ridge descent, comparing line-reading approaches, and it turned into something genuine. 2 people who understood terrain talking about terrain, the language shifting from careful courtesy to the directness that comes when you're both looking at the same problem. More cadets came in over the following hours. Not all of them. The final count of successful passes would be 31, which was just below 50%, lower than the historical average. The trial had been harder than usual, for reasons the faculty would later attribute to an unseasonable wind shift that had pushed temperatures lower in the valley section than the baseline model projected. We met cadets who had been on the plateau for 60 hours and were worn to the bone, and arrived with the look of people who had made a choice and kept making it through the whole long, dark middle of the trial. They were not diminished. They were something harder than they'd been when they left. I respected them in a clear, uncomplicated way. At hour 71, the shuttle came for the gate arrivals. We boarded last, the 4 of us, because we'd been there the longest and the others had claims on the good seats. I don't remember who said it. One of the Garavan cadets from the first arrival group, the one who'd asked if we were cold. As we boarded, he said something to Dresh, quietly, and Dresh was quiet for a moment after, and then he got on the shuttle. I asked him once we were airborne. He said, "I don't know what you are, but the proving engine should have known before it sent you." Outside the shuttle window, the plateau was passing below us, white and gray and blue in the early morning light, crossed by the wind-packed trails of 62 people moving through it over 3 days. Most of those trails converged on the gate. A few ended in extraction coordinates. I watched it until we were above the cloud layer, and there was nothing to see but white. "He's not wrong," I said. Dresh looked out his own window at the same nothing. "No," he said, "he's not." We landed at the Institute 40 minutes later. We went through intake processing, biometric review, debrief intake form, the standard post-trial administrative sequence, and then we were released to the dormitory wing. Most of the other returning cadets went immediately to their bunks. I understood that. 60 to 70 hours of cold survival effort earns your sleep without negotiation. We went to the dormitory wing too. We slept. In the afternoon, I stopped by the equipment storage bay to return the thermal wraps, which I'd repaired with a needle and the remaining synthetic fiber from Priya's wrap binder, sewing the edge binder back in place with a seam tight enough that you'd have to look carefully to find the repair. I set them on the returns counter, and the equipment officer, a civilian staff member, Garavan, older, who'd been running equipment logistics at the Institute for longer than most cadets had been alive, looked at them. Looked at me. He picked up one of the repaired wraps and examined the seam. "You sewed this," he said. "Yes," I said. "During the trial." "Before the trial, in the prep time." He turned the wrap over, set it down, looked at me with the particular expression of someone who is deciding whether to ask the question that's actually in their mind. He asked it, "Was any of it hard?" I thought about how to answer that honestly. "The scree descent was hard," I said. "Sustained attention in cold conditions over loose terrain that asks something of you. And the night on the gate was cold until we got the shelter rigged. The second hour was the worst of it." He nodded. "The second hour." After that it was just waiting. He nodded again. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The Keth proving engine has been running trials on this plateau for 43 years. In that time it has logged over 3,000 individual cadet records." He paused. "It has never had to open a new category before." I didn't say anything. "It will be opening one now," he said, "for whatever it names what you 4 did." I thanked him and left. 3 days later, Instructor Velsoth's office was small and held more books than I'd expected, physical books, which are unusual in a Garavan institution where information storage is typically digital, and which I found unexpectedly heartening. Most of them were in Garavan, which I couldn't read well, but a few were in Interstandard, and the ones I could see the spines of were field manuals, survival curricula from other institutions, regional cold weather assessment guides. One that appeared to be a history of the trial itself, 43 years of proving plateau data, compiled. She had tea ready, which I hadn't expected either. Garavan tea is not what you'd hope from tea, but the gesture was precisely right. She asked about our childhoods, not personally, professionally, in the careful way of someone building a model. Where had each of us grown up? In what conditions? What had our preparation looked like before the institute? I told her about the mountains in my own case, the hiking and cold camping, and the particular education in not panicking that comes from spending a lot of time in places where panicking has direct consequences. I told her about the specific experience of being 16 in a tent at 8,000 feet when a storm came in faster than forecast, and spending 4 hours in the dark managing it. Not catastrophizing, not calling for rescue, just managing it, which is what you do when you're in it and there's no other option. That experience doesn't teach you anything you couldn't learn another way, but it does introduce you to a version of yourself that can handle the thing, and that introduction is not trivial. You spend the rest of your life knowing that person exists. Dresch told her about his grandfather and the lighter. He told it briefly and precisely. The summers in New Mexico, the specific lessons, the fact that the lighter was not really about fire, but about the principle that you bring what you need rather than hoping the environment will provide it. Velsoth wrote that down. She wrote a lot of what Dresch said down. Priya talked about the terrain of the Himachali highlands like it was a language she'd learned to read. She talked about the specific gradient vocabulary of mountain terrain, the way a slope tells you things about its surface if you've walked enough slopes to hear it. And I watched Instructor Velsoth's expression do something careful and precise as she listened, the expression of someone revising a prior assumption. Oak was brief and precise, as Oak always is. He summarized the relevant facts of his preparation without editorial, and she absorbed it without needing more. She asked about the cordage, about the fire, about the watch schedule and the shelter configuration and the decision to rebuild the thermal wraps before departure. She asked about the second-hour cold. "You said the second hour was the hardest," she said. "I understand that from an equipment standpoint, that was before your shelter was fully rigged, but were you concerned?" "No," I said. "Not at all." I thought about it. "I was attentive," I said. "There's a difference between concerned and attentive. I was paying attention to the cold the way you pay attention to anything that could become a problem. But it wasn't a problem yet, and I had the tools to manage it before it became one. Concern is what you feel when you're not sure you have the tools." She was quiet for a moment. "And you were sure?" "I was sure about what I knew how to do," I said. "I was less sure about the scree. I've never read scree like that before. Priya had, so I followed Priya." Velsoth wrote something down. She looked at it. "You assigned leadership based on demonstrated knowledge, not rank." "We don't really have internal rank," I said. "We have areas where each of us is the right person to make the call." She wrote that down too. Then she was quiet for a moment, looking at whatever she'd written, and when she looked up again something had shifted slightly in her posture, not much, but enough to read. "Cadet Sakal," she said. "The Keth Proving Engines category review will likely conclude that your squad's result should be logged as a pass with a notation flag, distinct from the standard pass category. The faculty will probably discuss whether future human cadets should receive adjusted trial parameters, different terrain, different duration, different provisions, to better calibrate the assessment to human physiological and skill baselines." "That seems reasonable," I said. "Does it?" She looked at me directly. Some would argue that the point of a standard trial is the standard, that adjusting it for different species defeats the purpose. The purpose of the trial, I said, is to assess whether a cadet has the survival knowledge and composure to operate in adverse field conditions. The parameters that make the plateau adverse for a Garavan cadet are not the same parameters that make it adverse for a human cadet. A genuinely accurate assessment would need to locate the actual edge of what's difficult for us, not just apply your edge and see what we do with it. She looked at me for a moment. Outside her window, the Institute's training grounds were active, cadets in the yard, a drill running, voices carrying faintly through the glass. "You're telling me," she said slowly, "that for the assessment to mean anything, it needs to actually test you." "Yes," I said. "And the proving plateau doesn't." "Not for us," I said, "not as currently designed." She was quiet for a long time, long enough that I looked at the physical books on her shelf and at the one about the trial's history and thought about 43 years of data and what it felt like to have a 44th year that required a new category. Not because something had gone wrong, because something had gone somewhere the system hadn't anticipated. "The faculty," she said finally, "is going to find this conversation frustrating." "Probably," I said. "And you're comfortable with that?" I looked at her. "Instructor Velsath, I'm comfortable with most things." She looked back at me. Something in her eyes that I recognized from the briefing theater, not quite sympathy, not quite apology, but something different now. Something more like recognition. The adjustment of an assessment in real time by someone honest enough to make it openly. "Yes," she said, "I'm beginning to understand that." Outside, the drill continued. Cadets moved across the yard in the cool institute air, learning the things they were here to learn, each of them working toward the edge of what they could do. We had all winter. We would find ours.